Hello and welcome to your lecture on World War II. The war begins. Grab your student notes and use them to follow along and fill in any blanks that you missed in class. Fewer than 20 years ago, in 1919, people were calling World War I the war to end all wars. The Treaty of Versailles formed the League of Nations, a group of countries brought together to settle disputes and prevent future wars. Then history said, challenge accepted. And the war that followed, World War II, which lasted from 1937 to 1945, proved to be the deadliest war in human history. The two sides were the Allied powers and the Axis powers. You'll recognize the names on the Allied powers list because they're the same as those in World War I. You have Britain, France, Russia, and eventually the United States. On the Axis side, you have countries a bit different from those during World War I, a bit different from the Central Powers. You still have Germany, but you also have Italy joining her and Japan. The name Axis powers comes from the rod that runs through the center of a globe. That rod is called the axis, and around the axis, the globe spins. Germany and Italy, and later Japan, wanted to be the axis around which the world spun. For a while, the world did spin around the Axis powers, and what a deadly spinning it was. Estimates vary, but between 70 and 85 million people died during World War II. That number includes both soldiers and civilians, non-soldiers, because both sides had no qualms about targeting civilians. As with many wars, the causes of World War II are complex, but two of the root causes happen to be our old friends, social Darwinism and imperialism. Social Darwinism is the belief that survival of the fittest ought to be applied to human society. In other words, you have two basic classes of humans, the fit and the unfit. The fit should and will survive at the expense of the unfit, who should die. Depending on the time period, the country, and the social Darwinist, those unfit people might be the poor, the disabled, the non-white, or the Jewish. But whoever they were, human society would be better off without them. Whether, like British and American social Darwinists in the 19th century, you thought it best to just let nature take its course and let them die in the streets, or, like Adolf Hitler, you thought it was time to start actively murdering them. Social Darwinist thought was prevalent in both Germany and Japan in the years prior to World War II. Adolf Hitler argued that the German people, particularly the blonde-haired, blue-eyed German people with no intellectual disabilities or physical deformities, was a master race. The German people were the best in the world, and they deserved to rule it. In Japan, Japanese scholars and the Japanese government argued that the Japanese people were the superior race in Asia, and therefore it was only natural that they should rule it. And why might they think that? Well, if you look at a map of East Asia prior to World War II, you will notice that it is divided up very neatly into British, French, American, and Dutch colonies. In other words, the vast majority of East Asia belonged to European and American powers. But of the very few countries that had managed to maintain their own sovereignty, there was only one that had its own colony. There was only one that had managed to modernize, industrialize, westernize, build up her military and her navy to the point where she could even defeat a European power. Only one country that was recognized as a world power in her own right, who had been invited to the Paris Peace Conference to create the Treaty of Versailles. That country, of course, was Japan. She had survived. Survival of the fittest, right? Isn't it obvious that the Japanese were the fit and the rest of the Asian peoples the unfit? And therefore, wasn't it only natural that the Japanese should rule them? Social Darwinism is not based on fact. It's not based in logic when you think about it hard enough, but it is compelling. And one of the things that it compels countries to do is practice imperialism. Imperialism, of course, is when a nation expands its power over other countries by force. And social Darwinism encourages imperialism by saying, don't worry, it's fine if you conquer other countries because you are the fit. You are born to survive. And those other countries are unfit. So it's not just fine for you to take them over, it's scientific. As with imperialism before World War I, the imperialism practiced by Germany and Japan was wrapped up in a nice, inspiring package. Imperialism was justified, it was necessary for the country practicing it, and even beneficial to the peoples who were conquered. In Germany's case, Adolf Hitler argued that he was going to unite the Germanic peoples in a greater German Reich. After all, the Germans were not the only people in Europe with Germanic culture and who spoke German. Hitler said that he was going to bring all these peoples together in one glorious country. As for the Japanese, they had a lovely name for their future empire as well, the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. In other words, Japan would sweep through East Asia, liberating the Asian countries from their European masters. And once liberated, those Asian peoples would then be under Japan's protection, and Japan would educate them and civilize them until, in that co-prosperity sphere, they could all grow wealthy and happy together. Both Germany and Japan were very good at making their imperialism sound inspiring. As with pretty much all imperialism, however, those words rang very hollow when the results of that imperialism finally came about, because both Germany and Japan, when they invaded other countries and took them over, decided to enslave the people and strip the land of resources. Germany and Japan practiced imperialism and took over other countries long before World War II actually began. In fact, World War II didn't begin until 1937 for Japan and 1939 for Germany, when other countries finally objected to Japan and Germany's expanding empires. In 1937, China stood up against Japan's attempts to declare her a Japanese preserve. By declare her a Japanese preserve, I mean that the Japanese government stated to the world that China was now under Japanese protection, and therefore the Chinese government was not allowed to do or say anything of any importance without Japanese permission. China responded, "Excuse me?" And both sides went to war. In 1939, Britain and France declared war on Germany after she invaded Poland. Up until this point, Adolf Hitler had managed to make the major European powers look the other direction while he gathered more territory into his ever-expanding empire. But Poland was a British and French ally. And so when Germany invaded Poland, Poland said, "Hey, Britain, France, we have an alliance, you have to defend me." And Britain and France said, "You're right. We do. Germany, we are now at war." Between the years 1937 and 1941, the Axis powers appeared to be winning. Germany managed to conquer much of Western Europe, including France. They hadn't conquered Great Britain yet, and so they launched a devastating bombing campaign on Great Britain known as the Blitz. Germany rained bombs on London in particular. But although Hitler had hoped that this bombing campaign, the Blitz, would force Britain's surrender, instead it served only to unite the Britons. Now they would not surrender to Hitler no matter what. Japan was doing very well with her imperialistic ambitions. She had managed to conquer part of China. She had managed to conquer a great deal of East Asia in general, including many European colonies. And here is where you start to see both sides of the war start to connect, because the territory that Japan is conquering now belongs to Europe, and the European powers do not appreciate having their colonies taken away from them. You might wonder in all this, where's the United States? And the answer is that up until the end of 1941, the United States remained officially neutral. In other words, they were not taking sides. Officially. Now, unofficially, they were actually aiding the Allies and lending them money, but officially they were neutral. And next week, we'll talk about the event that changed all that, that brought the United States into the war, and what happened next. See you next week.